Rain battered the cracked windows of a forgotten Chicago convenience store, masking the footsteps of a monster. Paying for a stranger's bread and bandages seemed like simple kindness. Little did one exhausted cashier know that single crumpled $20 bill just bought her the obsession of the city's deadliest ghost. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly pale yellow glow over the linoleum floor of Miller's Market. It was 11:40 on a Tuesday night, and the relentless Midwestern storm outside showed no signs of stopping. Cheryl Kennedy stood behind the scratched plexiglass of the checkout counter, her shoulders aching with the deep, settling exhaustion that only came from working 14 hours straight. At 23, Cheryl's life was a meticulous, agonizing spreadsheet of debts. Every dollar she earned at the convenience store went toward the crushing medical bills her father had left behind after his sudden passing. She had exactly $24.50 in her worn leather purse money that was supposed to cover her bus fare and groceries for the rest of the week. She was numb to the dreary routine eyes fixed on the rain washing down the glass doors, desperately waiting for the midnight shift change. Then, the rusted bell above the door chimed. A blast of freezing, rain-soaked air swept into the store, carrying with it the sharp metallic tang of copper and wet asphalt. Cheryl looked up, instantly tensing. The man who walked in didn't belong in this part of the city. Even soaked to the bone, his presence demanded an uncomfortable amount of space. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a heavy, dark wool trench coat that looked far too expensive for the neighborhood. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his jaw was set in a rigid, unforgiving line. But it was his eyes that made Cheryl's breath hitch. They were a piercing, stormy grey, hollowed out by pain and a cold, calculating intensity that made her instincts scream at her to hide. He moved with a stiff, deliberate slowness, like a predator injured in a fight. Cheryl watched nervously as he navigated the narrow aisles, his heavy boots leaving a trail of watery footprints on the dusty floor. He didn't browse. He moved with singular purpose toward the pharmacy aisle, then to the back where the meager selection of baked goods sat. When he finally approached the counter, Cheryl noticed the heavy way he leaned against the register. He dropped his items onto the conveyor belt, a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, thick medical gauze, a roll of athletic tape, a loaf of cheap white bread, and 2 bottles of purified water. "Did you find everything you need?" Cheryl asked, her voice trembling slightly. Up close, the metallic smell was overpowering. It wasn't just rain. It was blood. The stranger didn't speak immediately. He just stared at her. His face was bruised along the left cheekbone, and beneath the collar of his expensive coat, Cheryl could see the edge of his white dress shirt, stained with a blooming, horrifying crimson patch. "Just ring it up." He rasped his voice, a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated with suppressed agony. Cheryl swallowed hard, quickly, scanning the barcodes. "That comes to $18.75. The man reached into his coat with his right hand, his jaw clenching in obvious pain, and pulled out a sleek black leather wallet. He produced a matte black credit card, the kind without numbers on the front, heavy and metallic, and slid it into the chip reader. The machine beeped loudly, declined, a muscle feathered in his jaw. "Run it again." Cheryl pressed the button, her hands shaking. It says the account has been frozen. Do you have another card or cash?" The stranger stared at the small digital screen as if it had betrayed him. For a fleeting second, the formidable, terrifying aura surrounding him cracked, revealing a man who was cornered, bleeding, and entirely out of options. He patted his pockets, his breathing growing shallow and ragged. Nothing. He closed his eyes, a bitter, dark chuckle escaping his lips. Of course they did. They took the accounts. He opened his eyes, looking at the medical supplies, then up at Cheryl. The look in his eyes was one of pure, dangerous desperation. "I need these items. I'll bring the money tomorrow. 10 times the amount. Just let me take them." Cheryl's pulse pounded in her ears. Store policy was strict. If her manager found out she gave away merchandise, she would be fired on the spot. Losing this job meant eviction. It meant starving. But as she looked at the stranger, she didn't see a threat anymore. She saw a human being bleeding out in front of her. She saw the same desperate, hopeless pain she felt every time she looked at her father's past-due medical bills. Before her brain could process the risk, Cheryl reached under the counter, grabbed her purse, and pulled out her only $20 bill. She hit the cash button on the register, the drawer popping open with a sharp ding, and slid her own money into the slot. She quickly bagged the items and pushed them across the counter. "Your change is $1.25, Cheryl said softly, handing him the coins. The man stared at the plastic bag, then at the coins in his hand, and finally at Cheryl. The stormy grey of his eyes widened in genuine shock. For a man who had seemingly seen the darkest corners of the world, a simple act of charity had completely unmoored him. "You paid for this," he stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet whisper. "Why?" "Because you're bleeding," Cheryl said, trying to keep her voice steady. "And because everyone has bad nights. Just take care of yourself." He didn't move for a long moment. He studied her face, mapping her features, as if etching them into his memory permanently. He looked at her worn-out uniform, the dark circles under her eyes, and the faded name tag pinned to her chest. "Cheryl." He read aloud the name, sounding foreign and heavy on his tongue. "Just go," she urged, glancing nervously toward the back office, "before my manager comes out." The stranger picked up the bag. He leaned in slightly, the scent of expensive cologne and copper washing over her. "You have no idea what you just did for me, Cheryl. I do not forget debts. Ever." With that, he turned and walked back out into the freezing rain, swallowed by the darkness of the Chicago night. Cheryl let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, shivering as the cold air dissipated, leaving her alone with her empty purse and a pounding heart. 3 days passed. The storm had cleared, leaving the city locked in a bitter, damp chill, but the strange encounter at the convenience store remained burned into Cheryl's mind. She had tried to convince herself that the man was just a luckless drifter, maybe a gambler who had gotten in too deep. But a part of her knew better. Men like that didn't just stumble out of the void and return to it quietly. On Friday morning, the strange occurrences began. Cheryl was sitting at her tiny kitchen table in her cramped, drafty apartment, dreading the inevitable knock on the door. Her landlord Hector was a ruthless man who took pleasure in tormenting tenants who were late on rent. Cheryl was exactly 3 weeks behind. When the knock finally came, she jumped, clutching her coffee mug tightly. She walked to the door, unlocking the deadbolt with trembling fingers. "Hector, I promise I'll have half of it. By—" She stopped. Hector was standing in the hallway, but all the bluster and arrogance were completely gone from his face. He was sweating profusely, his face pale, his eyes darting around the hallway, as if expecting a sniper to take him out. He held out an envelope toward her, his hands shaking violently. Your rent is paid, Miss Kennedy," Hector stammered, swallowing hard. "Paid in full, for the next 2 years. And the late fees are waived. Please just tell them I didn't mean any disrespect." Before Cheryl could ask who "them" was, Hector practically bolted down the hallway, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Cheryl stood frozen, staring at the thick envelope in her hand. Inside was a stamped receipt for her apartment, zeroing out her balance, along with the lease agreement paid through to the following year. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't possible. She didn't have any family left. She didn't have friends with that kind of money. The unsettling feeling only grew as she left for work. As she walked the 4 blocks to the bus stop, she couldn't shake the prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She was being watched. Glancing over her shoulder, she noticed a sleek black SUV with heavily tinted windows idling at the corner. When she stopped, it stopped. When she walked, it crawled forward. Panic began to claw at her throat. By the time she reached the grocery store, her nerves were completely frayed. She threw herself into stocking shelves, trying to drown out the paranoia with the mindless repetition of organizing canned soup. Around 10 o'clock that night, the store was blissfully empty. Cheryl was sweeping the back aisle when she heard heavy footsteps approaching. Assuming it was a late-night customer, she turned around with a practiced smile. "Can I help you find—" The words died in her throat. Standing at the end of the aisle was a man, but not the stranger from Tuesday night. This man wore a cheap, ill-fitting brown suit. His face was pockmarked, and his eyes were flat and dead. He reeked of stale tobacco and cheap alcohol. He casually pulled a badge from his pocket, flashing it at her, though he didn't look like any cop Cheryl had ever seen. "Detective Gregory Lawson." The man grunted, chewing on a toothpick. He stepped closer, backing Cheryl against the shelving unit. "You were working Tuesday night during the storm. Let's have a chat, sweetheart." I already spoke to the beat cops about the shoplifters from last month," Cheryl stammered, gripping her broom handle tightly. Lawson chuckled a dry, rasping sound. He reached into his coat and pulled out a grainy black-and-white photograph printed on standard paper. It was a still from the store's security camera. In the frame, Cheryl was handing the plastic bag to the tall, dark-haired stranger. "I don't care about shoplifters," Lawson snarled, stepping into her personal space. "I care about this man. Do you know who this is?" "No," Cheryl said honestly, her voice shaking. "He just came in to buy some first aid supplies. His card declined, so I covered it. That's it." Lawson's eyes narrowed into vicious slits. He suddenly reached out, grabbing Cheryl by the collar of her uniform and slamming her hard against the metal shelves. Cans of soup clattered to the floor. "Don't lie to me, you stupid girl," Lawson hissed, spit flying from his lips. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That is Amar Costello. He's the head of the Costello Syndicate. He was supposed to bleed out in an alleyway 3 nights ago. My employers paid a lot of money to make sure he didn't walk away. But instead, he vanishes, and the word on the street is some little convenience store rat patched him up." Cheryl's breath vanished. Amar Costello. The name was a phantom, a whisper on the local news, a boogeyman used to explain why politicians suddenly resigned or why buildings mysteriously burned down. He was the undisputed king of the city's criminal underworld, and she had bought him a loaf of bread. "I didn't know," Cheryl cried out, tears stinging her eyes. "Please let me go." "Where is he?" Lawson demanded, pressing his forearm against her throat, choking her. "He's cleaning house. He wiped out 2 of our safe houses this morning. Where is he hiding?" "She already told you, Lawson. She doesn't know." The voice was quiet, smooth, and colder than the ice on the pavement outside. Lawson froze. He slowly turned his head. Standing at the end of the aisle was Amar Costello. He was no longer the broken, bleeding man from Tuesday night. He was dressed in an immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal suit, a dark overcoat draped elegantly over his broad shoulders. Not a single hair was out of place. The bruises on his face had faded to a dull yellow, but his stormy grey eyes were sharp, lethal, and locked entirely on Lawson. Flanking Amar were 2 massive men in dark suits, their hands resting ominously inside their jackets. Lawson released Cheryl, stumbling backward. his hands shooting up in surrender. "Costello!" "Aymar, listen. The hit wasn't my idea. I was just taking orders. You touched what is mine." Aymar interrupted his voice, deadly calm. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. The sheer overwhelming authority in his tone sucked the oxygen right out of the room. Aymar gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod to the men beside him. Before Lawson could even draw his weapon, the two enforcers closed the distance. One struck Lawson behind the knees, dropping him, while the other placed a heavy hand over Lawson's mouth, dragging the struggling, terrified detective toward the back exit of the store. Not a single gunshot was fired. It was brutally, terrifyingly efficient. Within seconds the aisle was empty, save for Aymar and Cheryl. Cheryl slid down the shelving unit, her legs giving out completely as she hit the floor, gasping for air. She wrapped her arms around her knees, trembling violently. Aymar walked toward her slowly, his heavy, polished dress shoes clicking against the linoleum. He stopped in front of her and crouched down, ignoring the dirt on the floor that threatened his expensive suit. Up close, the lethal coldness in his eyes softened just a fraction as he looked at her. He reached out his large, warm hand, gently tilting her chin up. His thumb brushed lightly over the red mark Lawson's forearm had left on her neck. His jaw tightened furiously at the sight of it. "I told you I do not forget debts." "Cheryl," Aymar murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "But my survival came with a price. My enemies tracked my movements. They know you helped me, which means this city is no longer safe for you." "What? What are you saying?" Cheryl whispered, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks. Aymar stood up, offering her his hand. "I'm saying that you saved my life, and now I am going to save yours. You belong to the Costello family now. Come with me." The drive to the Costello estate was a blur of rain-slicked streets and suffocating silence. Cheryl sat rigidly in the back of the armored SUV, her hands tightly clutching the fabric of her damp uniform. Beside her, Aymar Costello was a statue of carved marble, exuding a quiet, terrifying power. He typed brief, rapid messages on a secured phone, dismantling rival operations and securing his empire with the casual ease of a man ordering dinner. They left the crumbling infrastructure of the inner city behind, winding up a secluded coastal highway until they reached a pair of towering wrought-iron gates. As the gates swung open, Cheryl gasped. The estate was a sprawling fortress of modern architecture and dark stone, perched on a cliffside overlooking the churning black waters of Lake Michigan. "Welcome to your new reality, Cheryl," Aymar murmured, his grey eyes catching the dim light of the dashboard. The moment she stepped out of the vehicle, a small army of staff and heavily armed security moved with synchronized precision. Aymar guided her into the grand foyer, a massive space of white marble, sweeping staircases, and chilling, echoing silence. It was beautiful, but it felt unmistakably like a vault. "Take her to the East Wing," Aymar commanded, a sharp-eyed woman in a tailored maid's uniform. "Ensure she has everything she needs. If anyone apart from myself or Dorian approaches her corridor, shoot them." Cheryl's stomach plummeted. She turned to him, panic rising. "Aymar, please. I have a life. I have an apartment. You can't just lock me up here." Aymar stepped closer, the physical warmth of his body contrasting with the freezing command in his gaze. "Your apartment is currently being watched by men who want to torture you to get to me. Your life, as it was yesterday, no longer exists. I am not locking you up, Cheryl. I am keeping you breathing. Go." Over the next 2 weeks, Cheryl existed in a state of luxurious purgatory. Her suite was larger than her entire apartment building, stocked with silk garments, catered meals and books. Yet she was a prisoner. She was not allowed near the windows, and 2 silent guards stood at the end of her hallway 24 hours a day. Her only regular company aside from the maids was Dorian Sanders. Dorian was Amar's underboss, a lethal, broad-shouldered man with a scar running through his left eyebrow and a cynical, wary disposition. He was assigned to be her personal shadow whenever she walked the interior gardens. "You don't like me much, do you?" Cheryl asked one afternoon, sitting on a velvet settee in the conservatory, while Dorian stood by the doorway, scanning the perimeter. Dorian glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's not about liking you, Miss Kennedy. It's about what you represent." Amar was a ghost. He was untouchable because he had no weaknesses, no attachments. Then he stumbled into your store, and now he's relocated half our security force just to watch you sleep. You are a liability. "I never asked for this." Cheryl shot back her frustration, finally boiling over. "I just bought him a bottle of peroxide and some bread, and in doing so you bought his life." Dorian replied, his voice softening just a fraction. "The men who came after him, the Rossi family, they had us completely outmaneuvered. Aymar should be dead. He knows it. I know it. You tipped the scales of a Mafia war with $20. So while I may view you as a liability, I also owe you my boss's life. I won't let anything happen to you." That evening, Aymar finally summoned her to his private study. The room smelled of old, paper-expensive bourbon and leather. He was standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He looked exhausted, the weight of his violent empire pressing down on his shoulders. "Sit," he instructed softly. Cheryl remained standing. "I want to know when I can leave." Aymar slowly turned, his eyes narrowing. "You are unhappy here." It wasn't a question. It was a realization that seemed to genuinely frustrate him. "I have given you absolute security. Your debts are eradicated. You have access to wealth you couldn't spend in 3 lifetimes. I am a pet in a very expensive cage," Cheryl said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I saved a man because he was hurting. I didn't sell my freedom to the mob." Aymar closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He towered over her, his presence intoxicating and terrifying. He reached out his knuckles, gently brushing against her cheek. The touch was startlingly tender for a man with so much blood on his hands. "You aren't a pet, Cheryl," he whispered, his stormy eyes locking onto hers. "You are the only real thing in a world built on lies and violence. Every person I have ever known has wanted something from me, money, power, my life. You gave me your last dollar when I had nothing. Do you understand what that does to a man like me? It breeds an obsession I cannot control." Before Cheryl could process the raw, unmasked devotion in his voice, the heavy oak doors of the study blew open. Dorian stood in the doorway, an assault rifle gripped tightly in his hands, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. "The perimeter is breached," Dorian shouted over the sudden distant crack of gunfire. "The Rossi family. They bypassed the north gate. They're inside the house." Chaos erupted, shattering the pristine silence of the Costello estate. The screech of the security alarms wailed like a dying beast bathing the hallways in a flashing, aggressive red light. Amar's demeanor shifted instantly. The vulnerable man who had just laid his soul bare vanished, replaced by the apex predator of the Chicago underworld. He drew a heavy matte black pistol from the holster beneath his jacket and grabbed Cheryl by the arm, pulling her behind his solid frame. "Dorian, the safe room. Now." Aymar barked, leading the way into the corridor. "They jammed the security doors, boss. We have to take the servant corridors down to the wine cellar." Dorian yelled back, firing a 3-round burst down the grand staircase as heavily armed mercenaries flooded the foyer. The air grew thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and pulverized drywall. Cheryl covered her ears, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She was shoved into the narrow, dimly lit servant corridors, running blindly behind Aymar. They reached the top of the cellar stairs, but a tactical team of Rossi's men had already flanked them, cutting off their escape. The hallway lit up with muzzle flashes. "Get down!" Aymar roared, tackling Cheryl to the ground behind a heavy marble pillar, just as a hail of bullets shredded the antique paintings behind them. Dorian provided covering fire, roaring in defiance, but there were too many of them. Cheryl watched in absolute horror as Aymar leaned out to return fire, only to be thrown backward by the sheer force of a bullet grazing his shoulder, tearing through his suit jacket. He hit the floor hard, a grunt of profound pain escaping his lips. "Aymar!" Cheryl screamed, crawling toward him over the shattered glass and debris. He gripped his bleeding shoulder, his face pale, but his eyes burning with furious adrenaline. "Stay back, Cheryl Dorian. We need to bottleneck them. I'm out of mags," Dorian shouted, dropping his empty rifle and drawing his sidearm. They were cornered. The footsteps of the Rossi hitmen grew louder, echoing menacingly down the marble corridor. They were seconds away from being executed. Cheryl looked desperately around the alcove, her eyes locked onto the emergency fire suppression panel on the wall encased in glass. Beside it was a heavy brass fire extinguisher. It wasn't a gun, but it was all she had. Without thinking, driven by the same reckless instinct that had made her empty her wallet for a bleeding stranger, Cheryl grabbed the extinguisher. "Cheryl, no!" Aymar yelled, reaching for her. She pulled the pin stepped out from behind the marble pillar and hurled the heavy metal canister directly down the hallway toward the advancing men. At the exact same moment, she screamed, "Shoot it!" Aymar didn't hesitate. His reflexes were inhuman. He raised his pistol and fired a single, perfect shot. The bullet struck the pressurized canister mid-air. It detonated with a deafening concussive boom, releasing a massive, blinding cloud of thick white chemical foam that completely engulfed the narrow corridor. The hitmen shrieked, blinded, and choking on the heavy retardant, their tactical formation instantly broken. "Move!" Aymar commanded, seizing the chaotic distraction. He and Dorian surged forward, ruthlessly, eliminating the disoriented threats in the fog with clinical, terrifying precision. By the time the white dust settled, the hallway was silent. The immediate threat was neutralized, and the distant sound of police sirens called in by the estate's automated systems began to wail through the rainy night. Aymar dropped his weapon, leaning heavily against the wall, as blood soaked the left side of his ruined suit. He slid down to the floor, breathing heavily. Cheryl rushed to his side, tearing the hem of her expensive silk dress. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were purposeful. She pressed the improvised silk bandage firmly against his bleeding shoulder, her eyes welling with tears. "You're bleeding again," she sobbed, applying pressure. "You are the most powerful man in the city, and you are constantly bleeding." Aymar looked down at her. Despite the agony tearing through his shoulder, a slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face. He reached up with his uninjured arm, wiping a tear from her soot-stained cheek. "And you saved my life. Again." Aymar rasped his voice, thick with emotion. He looked over at Dorian, who was watching the scene with profound, newfound respect for the former cashier. "She's a Costello now, boss," Dorian muttered, holstering his weapon and giving Cheryl a sharp, respectful nod before turning to secure the rest of the perimeter. Aymar looked back at Cheryl, his stormy grey eyes entirely vulnerable. "I told you I was keeping you here to protect you. But the truth is, I kept you here because I couldn't bear the thought of a world where you weren't by my side. You threw a fire extinguisher at trained killers to protect me. I panicked," Cheryl sniffled, offering a watery laugh. "You fought," Aymar corrected gently. "Tomorrow the Rossi family will cease to exist. This city will be quiet. If you want to leave, I will give you a new identity, a fortune, and you will never see me again. I will not keep you in a cage, gilded or otherwise." Cheryl looked at the terrified, exhausted cashier she had been 2 weeks ago, and realized that woman was gone. She looked at the lethal, deeply broken man bleeding under her hands, a man who would burn the world down to keep her safe. "I don't want to leave," Cheryl whispered, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "Just promise me no more cheap white bread." Aymar chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated against her chest. "Only the best for you, Cheryl, for the rest of our lives." Did this thrilling Mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved the intense twists, the high-stakes action, and the undeniable chemistry between Cheryl and Aymar, hit that like button and share this story with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a dramatic tale. Drop a comment below telling us what you would do if you accidentally saved a Mafia boss.